Language, of course, operates from a set of really explicit syntactical and grammatical rules, and actually music does too. It operates from a very strict and explicit set of syntactical and grammatical rules. But those rules are not the same ones, because music is not the same thing as language. But they're both rules that deal with patterns and sequences and how to make sense of them and how to process them. And one of the points I tried to make is that when you learn music and you learn language, you're also teaching your mind how to learn processes, how to make sense of syntactical rules and things like that. And that's a primary function of the human mind, to turn those sorts of symbolic information into knowledge and into learning. And if you learn, therefore, both music and language, then you're not only learning both music and language, which are definitely good things in their own right, but you're also learning, you're teaching the mind at a more fundamental level, perhaps how to deal with patterns and sequences and how to make sense out of them. And mathematics operates from its own set of syntactical rules too, which are a lot closer to language than the musical rules would be. But they're not the same as language by any means. So now you have three sets of syntactical rules that you're learning. And I would propose that those three sets of learnings are mutually reinforcing and complementary, and that if you exclude one, then you're hurting the ability to learn the other two.
Welcome to St. Louis in Tune, where we size up current and historic events involving people, places, and things in areas such as the arts, crime, education, employment, faith, finance, food, history, housing, humor, justice, and sports. Our weekly podcast gives you the edge to live a more informed life. We discuss more than just St. Louis as we connect the gateway city to our country's current cultural fabric and lives.
There has been a lot of studies and research done on students who are involved in music and how they do academically, how well they do academically. There has never been a study as it relates to the achievement in music related to the achievement in reading and mathematics. And our guest today, Martin Burgi, who's Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, who's Professor of Music Education and Music Therapy at the University of Kansas, is going to talk to us about that. Prior to his appointment at KU, he spent 20 years as a faculty member in music education at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Prior to that, he taught middle school and high school band in St. Joseph. He has served on the editorial committees of the Journal of Research in Music Education, the Bulletin of the Council for Research in Music Education, and currently he chairs the executive committee of the Music Education Research Council, the governing body of the Music Educator National Conference Society for Research in Music Education. Dr. Martin Burgi, welcome to St. Louis in Tune.
Hi, Arnold. Glad to be with you.
Now, I'm going to call him Martin because he and I go way back. We were classmates together at KU.
Right.
So I'm going to call him Martin and not Dr. Burgi.
No, don't call me Dr. Burgi, please.
I had a friend named Martin, and we called him Marty. I don't know if you have a short name other than Doc or Martin.
Marty is actually my name, but most people call me Martin, and I don't correct them.
There you go. Okay.
So I'll let Mark call you Marty, and I'll call you Martin, because that's how I referred to you when we were in school.
That way we'll know who's talking to you.
So, Martin, this is a very interesting study, and as I've read this, it really fills a gap in the research in music education and also in reading and mathematic education as far as the relationship. You know, my first question is, what was the reason for this study?
Well, there are two, one academic and one practical. The practical reason is that grant money was made available through the National Association of Music Merchants. And I felt at the time that I was one of the individuals who might be able to answer some of the more complex questions that NAM was trying to ask. The second thing is this business of music and reading and math being all related to one another. That's been around for a long time, and it seems to have grown legs. It seems to be something that hangs in people's minds. And from the relationship, it's easy, I think, to start to think in terms of cause and effect. If you study music, then you will be better, per se, at reading and math. And that's always been, to one degree or another, suspect with me. I've always assumed that the relationship was probably so-called spurious, meaning that there are other things that are actually controlling it. Things like where you go to school, where you live, what your ethnicity is, what your parents' education level is, how much money your family makes, and a whole bunch of other things. So I assume that if I threw all those variables into an equation, that the variables themselves, the demographics, would actually explain the relationship. And the pure relationship between math and reading and music would then essentially drop to zero. And much to my surprise, that's not what happened at all.
Well, let's get into your sample group and how you went about finding that sample group, because I think it's important that you did have a broad section of students who participated in this, and this was in grades, correct me if I'm wrong, 4 through 8, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so go ahead and explain your sample group.
I started out by taking a map of the state of Missouri, dividing it out by school districts, and then randomly choosing school districts, and then attempting to randomly choose schools within those school districts. And that went absolutely nowhere. I suspected it was going to, and it did. I would send a note cold to these school administrators, and Arnold, I'm sure you can understand that they get cranked notes like that all the time,
right? And
I'm sure that it was just dismissed out of hand. So that didn't work. Therefore, what ended up happening is I didn't have a sample that was statistically representative, but I still ended up with a pretty large sample. At the time, I was on the faculty at MU, and MU had a partnership for educational renewal. It was called. It was a partnership between school districts, certain school districts, and MU. And a lot of those superintendents, by virtue of that relationship, knew me, and I knew them. So I went to them and I said, "Can I use your school districts and schools and students within your district if there's some money involved?" Which there was. And they were quite agreeable, and they helped to set that up. So the good news is that I ended up with a lot of Missouri students, over 1,000. But the bad news, if it is bad news, is that they're not completely representative of Missouri as a whole or the nation as a whole. But still, there were quite a few of them.
And you do mention that in the study, that's kind of a little caveat to the randomization of that. But you had students from urban and suburban and rural areas, and there was one metropolitan areas was another area. Those were the areas, correct? It
was a pretty nice mix. It wasn't entirely statistically representative, but it was a pretty good mix. I was pretty happy with who I came up with.
So you go to the administrators, and they've selected some schools, and you are beginning to administer what? How are you going about to make this comparison and to find out what this comparison is all about?
The rub is I needed to test these students for music achievement, and that's not normally done. Music programs don't normally give students norm tests in music achievement.
Right.
They're more participatory and process-oriented in nature. So I asked the schools, the incentive being $2,000 per school, because that was written into the grant. I asked the schools if I or some employees of the grant could come in and give the students that were selected a music achievement test. And that's actually what we did. We got 50 minutes per school, per student, to give a music achievement test.
And was that an auditory test? Is it a written test, or kind of a combination of both?
It's a combination of both, actually. Most of it's auditory, but there's also a music reading component in the test.
Now, you gave that test, and you got results from that, and I believe it's the MAT-1 and the MAT-2, the Music Achievement Test. And there were 4 sections of that, but you only gave 2. And then you made the comparison with what?
With, as I'm sure you're well aware, Arnold, there's an MAP, a Missouri Assessment Profile program, that requires that every Missouri student be tested in math and reading on a regular basis. And of course, the school districts had that information, and that information was provided to me for the students that participated in the music achievement testing.
So you're making the MAP comparison in English language arts and mathematics to the music achievement tests, and you had to go through a lot of statistical analysis and formulas and et cetera like that. So what were some of the initial results that you got? And then I want to discuss kind of as you move through your analysis, what kind of things popped up.
Well, first I feel like I need to apologize for the complexity of the statistical analysis, but I set myself out to do something that was pretty complex, and unfortunately I needed a method of analysis that was complex, and then it reported out complex too. But there are things about it that are not particularly hard to absorb or to understand, some of which I expected and several of which I did not expect. First, the students that were tested, they were tested within a particular class, and that class is nested within a particular school, and of course that school is nested within a particular school district, and on up the nesting can go. So the first thing I needed to do is I needed to account for the nesting, where the variability actually came from. My assumption was that some variability would come from the students, but other sources of variability might be the classroom itself or the school district. And much to my surprise, the classroom and the school had very little influence on this on the variability in this study.
That is interesting.
And district had some influence, but not very much. But almost all the variability was actually located at the student level. That was one surprise.
What do you make of that?
I don't know. Maybe I did it wrong. The assumption is that among all of us that classrooms and schools and school districts have a profound effect on student learning and in its various manifestations. And I think that's true. They do, but somehow and for whatever reason, it didn't come out that way in this particular design. They added very little explanation to the results. District did a little bit, but classroom and school, no, they had very little influence on the outcomes.
Was the district one, Martin, based upon their location, or was there a factor that was kind of indicative of why the district one played a more major role than classroom or building?
I'm having to speculate here because I don't actually know, but I speculate that the reason the districts have an influence is because the districts are closest to a community level description or variable of some kind. And I think it does make a difference what community a child grows up in. And I think districts are most representative of those communities, as opposed to schools, which many schools are located within the same community.
So would that speak to maybe having different kinds of musical groups come in, or the value that's placed on music within the community, how community members participate in musical kinds of activities, or all of the above, or some that I may not even mentioned?
I would speculate that it's even broader than that. It's how a community approaches its schools. the extent to which it's able to fund them adequately, the extent to which it values its schools, the extent to which it expects young people who are in schools to learn and to value learning. And, of course, that's reflected in a lot of things, including its music programs.
Now let's get into now the individual student and the linkages you found, how that really manifests itself in reading and mathematics, and whether there were any differences between grade levels.
The grade level had to be put in there as a variable, but I didn't want it to be. The reason that it was in there was because the MAT does not control for grade level the same way a standardized test does. A standardized test, by definition, is designed to be taken by, say, fourth graders, and then another standardized test at a different level is designed to be taken by fifth graders. There were no effects, as there shouldn't have been. There were no grade level effects on the math and the reading exams because they've been calibrated to control for that. The MAT is not. So there were indeed grade level effects, but that's an artifact of the MAT. It has no meaning in and of itself. Mm-hmm. Practically speaking, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth graders were not different in any way in this model. Although grade level did account for a fair amount of variability. That's because of the way the MAT is set up. So even though grade level looks like a strong effect, what I needed to do was control for it and then get it out of the way. The more crucial variables were so-called urbanicity, or where the students actually reside, their biological sex, male or female, their ethnicity, the level of education in the family, whether or not the students participate in a free or reduced price lunch program. And that's basically it for the student level. There might be others, but they're escaping my memory at the moment. But those are really the crucial variables.
And those are the critical variables that we deal with as educators across the board all the time.
Right.
Exactly. My assumption was that those variables would completely wipe out once they're accounted for, they're controlled for, that they would completely wipe out the relationship between academic areas, between academic achievement.
And you were truly surprised that they did not.
Well, they did. They accounted for all kinds of variability, as they were expected to. But the relationship remained really strong, very strong, between the academic achievement areas themselves, math, reading, and music. The academic achievement was not explained by those variables, not in its entirety, even though I assumed that it would be.
Right. What do you gather that this relationship is established between music achievement and reading and mathematics achievement?
Well, of course I don't actually know, but because it was a finding in one of my own studies, I'm then obligated to offer up some reasonable speculations, and I think what I did say in the article is more than speculation. I think the people who, and there are a lot of them, the people who are sincere about schooling and really want schooling to work for students, I would say they fall into two general ways of thinking about it. One, I think, is more correct than the other. I think most people see learning as being mostly modular. You learn quadratic equations in second hour, and then in third hour you're learning about the administration of Thomas Jefferson, say. And I think most people would say, if you were to ask them the question, they would say that those two subject areas, those two modes of learning, are not really connected to one another in a fundamental sense. Therefore, learning is modular. And then there's another camp, of which I'm a member, who says that those modes of learning are very strongly connected. but they're connected at levels that are not immediately apparent. They're connected at the level of so-called domain general learning. And that's what I think is really happening here. This is an expression of domain general learning. That is, there are processes of learning that are absolutely critical if children, if humans are to learn, but they're latent. They're below the surface of subject matter, even though they're just as, if not more important than subject matter learning. I'm not sure that made the slightest bit of sense, and I'm sorry.
No, that made a lot of sense.
We're wondering why no one's ever done this before, some of the research and things that you've done. It's just amazing.
Some of us, because it's just really hard to get enough people. I couldn't have done it without the grant I got from them, which ended up being almost $100,000. If you don't have that kind of funding behind you, you're just not going to be able to do a study like this.
Yeah, this study that Martin is talking about is multi-level models of the relationship between music achievement and reading and math achievement, and it was published in the Journal of Research in Music Education recently. He co-authored this with Kevin Weingarten. And what role did Kevin play in this, Martin?
Well, Kevin was a great co-author for this study because when he was at KU taking classes, he took classes in neuropsychology, and he was introduced to things in those classes that were really crucial to this study, things that I had no clue about, I'm sorry to say. So a lot of the information and a lot of the references in the discussion section are actually his, and he wrote a fair amount of that. So I'm really grateful to him, and I don't know what I've done. I don't know how I would have interpreted the study or come up with an interpretation of the study without him. Currently, he's at the University of Washington as a visiting professor of music ed.
We have, in the education world, have always kind of known a difference, or not a difference, but a similarity with the ability to distinguish pitches and reading, and i.e., your brain will substitute some things because it wants to fill some gaps in, and there is a lot of neuroscience out there. And I kind of wanted to talk about that, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, the neuropsychology in your discussion section, because I want to read a couple quotes that you had here. Basic auditory skills have been shown to mediate music training and reading ability. And then you also have a quote in here that says that syntactic integration resource hypothesis, which posits that we use similar cognitive mechanisms when processing both musical and linguistic sequences. So the role of neuroscience and what is happening in the brain, and you kind of get into this in the discussion section, where which portion of the brain utilizes and interprets reading and deals with reading instruction, and which portion of the brain deals with musical instruction and that ability. Discuss a little bit about kind of what you found or how that's kind of opening some doors, as you previously mentioned, for you.
Well, I'm happy to, but I need to say up front that I'm a music teacher. I'm a band director, so it's possible for me to be out of my water here pretty quickly with some of this stuff. And
we'll keep you in the pool.
I'm doing the best I can, so please keep that in mind. Language, of course, operates from a set of really explicit syntactical and grammatical rules, and actually music does too. It operates from a very strict and explicit set of syntactical and grammatical rules. But those rules are not the same ones because music is not the same thing as language. The processes that language uses are they're specific to language, and the processes used in music are specific to music. But they're both rules that deal with patterns and sequences and how to make sense of them and how to process them. And one of the points I tried to make is that when you learn music and you learn language, you're also teaching your mind how to learn processes, how to make sense of syntactical rules and things like that. And that's a primary function of the human mind, to turn those sorts of symbolic information into knowledge and into learning. And if you learn, therefore, both music and language, then you're not only learning both music and language, which are definitely good things in their own right, but you're also learning, you're teaching the mind at a more fundamental level, perhaps how to deal with patterns and sequences and how to make sense out of them.
Which would then, to me, really translate to mathematical equations and things like that, being able to understand the parts and how they fit together.
Exactly. And mathematics operates from its own set of syntactical rules, too, which are a lot closer to language than the musical rules would be. But they're not the same as language by any means. So now you have three sets of syntactical rules that you're learning. And I would propose that those three sets of learnings are mutually reinforcing and complementary, and that if you exclude one, then you're hurting the ability to learn the other two. And it's not just those three, of course. The study dealt with just those three.
Right. So I know you had some limitations, and you came to a conclusion in your study that you warned people against kind of using this as a stamp to say, yes, this is the end-all, we've got this down. Would you discuss specifically what you would like people to take from this study?
Well, it's one study, and as much as those of us who do studies would like to think otherwise, in reality, one study is not going to really change fundamentally anything. But that said, I do think this study helps point in a direction that I think is healthy for children, and I think it's healthy for music too, which is subject areas are separate domains, and each one of these domains involves learning. And by the way, music is a product of the mind. It's a set of intellectual contributions to human society. It's not just for mood optimization or to provide background for social events or to headbang at concerts and things like that. It makes an intellectual contribution, and therefore it's in schools. These domains, they're separate, but they also are not separate. They have connections at fundamental levels that make them crucial to the ability to learn and to teach students how to learn. And therefore, I would caution anyone against thinking that some are more dispensable than others, because they're too strongly interconnected at certain levels in the mind. You either believe that students and humans should learn, or you don't. But I think most people would say that they think that students and young people should be learning.
So implications for educators with this study. And I'm going to give you some individual groups in particular. Okay. Teachers, administrators, Board of Education members.
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems to me, and this is more true of secondary schools than it is of elementary schools, but I think it's becoming increasingly true in elementary schools too, where teachers are starting to specialize in subject areas. And certainly the secondary school is a collection of individuals who are professional specialists in their subject areas. And I think among teachers that tends to place us into, and we do this to ourselves, we place ourselves into silos. There's the band director silo, there's the history and social studies silo, et cetera, all around the school. I mean, that you can end up with dozens, if not scores, of silos. And I think teachers, and I was the same way when I was a school teacher, are not particularly inclined to reach across those subject areas to see what the commonalities might be and how we could reinforce one another. And I know that involves more meetings and more time, and I get that. School teachers don't have a lot of time. And at the building principal level, it seems to me, I've never been a principal, and I don't think I would have been a very good one. I think the job would have eaten me alive. But principals have to deal with a lot of things, and it seems like more and more they have to deal with more and more. And it's difficult for a principal, a building principal, to see himself or herself as a true academic leader for the building. Mostly becomes a matter of custodial and administrative leadership, but not necessarily academic leadership. And then I'm generalizing here. I'm not talking about every principal by any means, but any principal has to feel the pressure to deal with the day-to-day crises first. And I guess in the best of all possible worlds, it would be great if principals would find a way to facilitate teachers to get together and to talk about their subject areas among themselves and to reach some decisions about commonalities and also uniquenesses. My advice to school board members is to think very carefully about what you plan to cut. You can't cut off someone's leg and expect to improve them somehow. And you can't just shrug your shoulders and say, well, it has to be done. It's not that simple. That's not your position. That's not your function as a member of a school board. To me, and I've never been a member of a school board either, and I know that you have, Arnold. It seems to me that a school board has the responsibility to provide the children in their communities what these children need in order to succeed as school children. And not every school board does that. Most do, I think, but not all the time. And I know that they have pressures on them, too. There's nothing philosophical about $1. I mean, it's either there or it isn't. It can't be discussed or argued with or anything like that. So I guess that's my answer to your question.
So
not sure it's a very good answer or a very new answer.
You know, I think it reiterates some things that many in the music profession who are educators, many parents who have a musical inclination, either they have been in bands or orchestras or choirs, and they realize the importance, and many administrators who also have benefited from those particular kinds of things also realize those things. Is there something that you would say to parents and or children / students if you had the opportunity to have a meeting with them, whether at the level that you did research, grades 3 through 8, I think it was 3 through 8, 4 through 8 rather, and then the parents of really any student about the importance of music and creating an environment where music is not only appreciated but is an extension into the other areas that you talked about?
As a parent myself, that's a good question. What would I like to have heard from a music teacher or a person who works in that particular field? I guess what I'd want to say to parents is that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about musical ability and musical thinking that we all need to get past, which is that some have it and some don't. And if you have it, fine. But if you don't, that's fine too. But in reality, music, like language and math and several other things, is a fundamental mode of human thinking. It's a fundamental mode of human expression. Therefore, everyone is musical, just like everyone is a linguist. That's our biological and cultural heritage. And therefore, it's incumbent on the school district and other people, too. It doesn't have to be only within the school. It's incumbent on society, on communities, and on schools to develop that part of their child's mind, just like it's incumbent on schools to develop other parts of their children's minds, the mathematical part, the linguistic part, the social part, etc. So that's what I'd say. I would say to them that your child is musical because every human being is musical. It's part of our biological and cultural heritage.
And what would you say to kids? What would you want someone who knows what you know say to your child?
Wow. My child was an all-state clarinetist, so I never had to convince her of anything. And her level of talent as a musician was quite high. Some of that was, of course, because of the amount of resources we were able to throw at her, private lessons, a good instrument, and so forth.
I think he's a proud papa.
I guess what I'd say to kids, I don't think little kids need to have this explained to them. I think little kids are quite pleased to express their inherent musicality. I think they love it and they enjoy doing it. It's when they get a little bit older, say the onset of adolescence, that I think students of adolescence need to be persuaded, if you will, that music does not belong to a select few, and that the way that they approach music, the way they listen to it, the choices that they make, those are intellectual operations, and they're important intellectual operations. And therefore they deserve to be studied, and they deserve to be shaped. And by shaped, I don't mean someone should impose choices, but I think that every person in this society who has an incredible amount of music thrown at them every day should have the skills to discern between quality and not quality, to understand why they like certain things more than others. And that's not latent. Those things are active and they're important, and it's an important part of how a student grows into adulthood. I'm not sure that would reach an adolescent. Adolescents are hard to reach, but I don't think that makes it any less true.
I agree with that, because executive function hasn't kicked in yet to realize those things.
No.
It all hasn't.
If it has, they have these buzzing things happening inside of them that drown everything else out.
Yeah. It takes a while for all those wires to come together in their head. It just takes years. There's just no way around that.
It's our obligation as adults to try to help them to understand the world that they live in. And
good point.
I'm not sure we always do a very good job of that.
Very good point.
Well, and I think one of the struggles in high schools at this time, and how academic standards are being pressed, and I understand that many students have to make some tough choices and decisions about their coursework, which either takes them into a path of the arts, music, or keeps them out of it. And those are some real difficult choices and decisions that kids and parents have to make that have some long-term consequences.
But I would say that the schools themselves and the school districts themselves are forcing some of those decisions when they don't need to.
Absolutely.
There are students at my daughter's high school who were all-state performers as well, who did all kinds of things. They went to MIT and Stanford and places like that. They were not forced to give up something for something else, something that they valued and were good at. And I don't think that's necessary. I think that's an imposition. I don't think it's a choice that students necessarily or families necessarily want to make.
I agree with you. And it's a situation that's unfortunate many times when paths have to be drawn like that and decisions have to be made like that, and schools and districts kind of force that one way or the other, that we're not developing the total student, as you were talking about, the community is not really developing that one way or the other.
I think your key word is that these are decisions. That they're not inevitabilities. They're decisions that people make. And I would say that some of the decisions are not made for economic reasons. I would say some of the decisions reflect values.
Which is a whole nother study.
Oh, yeah.
And not one I'm going to do.
The value of music instruction in schools. Yeah, that's a whole nother study. Martin, I appreciate you coming on the show today and talking about this. When I saw this in an email that I received, I was like, holy smokes. Number one, I know this guy. Number two, this is a very interesting study, and the fact that you were surprised at the results was number three. And I thought this is something that we need to talk about and have people hear, and maybe they can do some further investigation on their own and bring this information to people who are in positions that make some decisions that impact kids on a daily basis. And I'm glad you said the things you said to board members and to administrators and teachers. I thought those were extremely important.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I hope that I did okay. Articulating this sort of thing to an audience, I'm sorry to say, is not something that I do as often as I should.
Well, you did a great job, and I greatly appreciate you being on. We've been talking to Martin Burgi, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Professor of Music Education and Music Therapy at the University of Kansas, discussing his research study in multi-level models of the relationship between music achievement and reading and math achievement that can be found in the National Association for Music Education Journal. Martin, thanks again for being on St. Louis in Tune. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
We are happy you listened to this episode of St. Louis in Tune. Keep up to date and sign up on our mailing list. St. Louis in Tune is produced in cooperation with KWRH 103.9 FM and Multimedia. For St. Louis in Tune,